Today's video is going to be a full in-depth tutorial on building some cooling racks, cooling trays for your kitchen. These are sized for something like a lasagna pan being the biggest, but anything smaller than that will work. I'll provide you my dimensions. You can adjust these as needed. These are relatively low cost, low labor intensive, not a high barrier in terms of tools. Table saw, flush trim saw, and glue, and then table saw, flush trim saw, and bandsaw and glue for this guy right here. I'm going to walk you through every step. I'm going to provide timestamps below so you can skip through things. If you have a different way of doing something than I do it, absolutely feel free to go ahead. This isn't written in stone. This is just how I approach this. A few mistakes were made, a few changes were made along the way, but I think these turned out really well. All right, so let's talk about the materials needed as well as the aesthetic choices that will help determine how much you need. For the very basic one, just gonna need a 2x6 and only a portion of it, but get a whole 2x6, but that's all you'll need for that. For the curved one, which I'm gonna make a bit chunkier, I'm going with a piece of sassafras that I'm gonna end up planing down to about 1.5. And then we're gonna need our pieces to be at least 10 inches to start for the two ends. So you'll need two of those for either of these. And then you're gonna need a piece that's at least 15 inches, preferably a little longer for the slats in the middle. Now, the number of slats is going to determine how much you need, but I'm gonna be able to get mine out of something that's about 10 inches wide here. And with your 2x6, you'll have plenty to spare. If you want to go with something less kind of bulky, chunky, you absolutely can do it with just some common board. You can also get something nice and chunky with common board by just gluing a few pieces together to get something a little thicker in the end. So the choice of materials is going to depend somewhat on aesthetics, but we're going to be, for the purpose of this video, not working with the kind of thinner, narrower kind of look. We're going to go a little more chunky. All right, now for the tools needed. For this one here, you're just gonna need the table saw. For the simple one, some glue. A curved one, planer is gonna help absolutely to get the thickness and nice and flat. Table saw for that one as well, and then a bandsaw is going to be ideal. You can try to cut the curve with a jigsaw. Gonna be mixed results there probably. And then something to sand all of these as well. A hand sander will work fine in the end, or you can do it all by hand in general. The one other thing you may need if you don't cut your joints nice and tight and they're a little loose will be a drill to put some dowels up through the bottom to help pin them in there. But if you follow along with these instructions and do a few test cuts first to nail it in, you shouldn't have that problem at all. Now, for the most part, I'm going to be following a specific dimension list. However, I've got the rough dimensions for another option as well. And I'm going to bring you in here to kind of look at the aesthetics of the slat size and the kind of spacing in between them. I'm using 3/8 of an inch. Every slat is 3/8, every gap is 3/8. But I've also cut out a demo here of what 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch would look like. So you can decide now what you want to do with that. So there are two options here, which I think both work pretty well. Either the 3/8 inch slats with 3/8 inch spaces or 1/2 and 1/2. And this is kind of roughly what it will look like for the spacing and the sizing to help you determine 1/2 inch is a little chunkier, 3/8 is a little narrower, obviously. The dimension wise, if you go with 1/2 inch, we're gonna end up at about 9.5 inches total. And if you go with 3/8 of an inch, we're gonna end up at about 9 3/8 of an inch total. Hence why we're starting with 10 inch pieces for the end. So it's not a huge difference in size, it's just aesthetic. Let's look quickly at our dimensions. Both of these will be 15 inches long by the end. The slats are going to run to the end of each kind of side piece. If you want to do 3/8 of an inch slats, this is going to end up at 9 3/8. If you want to do 1/2 inch slats and 1/2 inch gaps, it's going to end up at 9.5. The first thing we're going to want to do here is square up two 10 inch pieces for each one. We're going to cut to final length towards the end to get to that 9 3/8 or 9.5. In case you're spacing, you mess it up a little bit. Therefore, we can trim the very end to exactly 3/8 or exactly 1/2 inch so that it at least looks more uniform instead of having kind of a narrower end on one side. I just think that's a good like safety valve at the end to do. If you totally believe in your ability to cut all of the grooves perfectly, you can trim them now to final length. I don't like doing that. For the sense of chunkiness here on the one I'm doing, and if you're going to use the 2x6, I'm not planing these down. This is just going to be used straight from the lumber yard. I have got this down to about 1.5 inches, and I just like that chunkier look. Now for those who are going to be doing the curved style, I'm going to have mine be about 1.5 inches thick all the way around the curve. And I'm going to start with a piece of wood that's about 2 3/8 inches in width. That'll allow us place to stick some nails to then draw out our curve and cut around that. Now this one will need to be cut down to size before the end, just due to how the curve is going to be cut out at one point. So here I'm going to now show you how I draw the curve out. If you're doing just the normal straight one, I'll leave a timestamp so you can skip right ahead. To lay out the curve, I'm just going to draw it out on this piece of 2x4 because it's going to be easier to see because the sassafras is quite dark. Going to need some kind of square, ruler, pencil, some nails, as well as if you have a 2x4, trim off the kind of rounded over part or any board until you get a piece that's about between 1/16 and a little under 1/8 of an inch thick. We're going to use this and pinch it between nails to essentially trace our curve. So you're going to need those things. Anything cut doesn't have to be from a 2x4, but if you happen to have a 2x4, just slice off that rounded part and it will leave you with a nice straight part on the inside. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to lay out our 9 3/8 of an inch inside of the edges of this board. It's much easier to do it inside so that when we go to stick a nail in, we have a place to pound it in instead of cutting this to 9 3/8 and then not being able to stick this nail on the outside. So just pick a spot and put your 9 3/8 and mark out the two ends of that. We're now going to just carry that line down. Make sure you've got a nice straight edge on this side. I'm looking from the top down, so the curve is going to go this direction facing you. I'm now going to take my material and just use it for reference because it's what I'm going to be using in the end, and then just mark out the line there for the thickness. And you're going to now just carry that line all the way across. Okay, we now want to find the direct center of this and mark that out. For 9 3/8, that's going to be 4 11/16. We're going to carry that line all the way down through. We're essentially just making kind of a coordinate area for us for when we apply our nails. Here's where the measurements get very specific. We are going to have a nail roughly here and roughly here. Now, because I want mine to be 1.5 inches thick, roughly all the way through, it'll get sanded some, so we'll lose some of that. I'm going to go up 1.5 inches from these bottom points. Remember, this is curving towards you. And then I'm going to go down 1.5 inches from our center line on the top. Now, our nail points are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're gonna put the 6th one here, but we're gonna go a little inside so that when we pinch, the outside straight part of this meets directly with the edge. We're going to start with the bottom curve. Now, I like using these little pin nails, tack nails, whatever, that don't have a large head. If you're going to use something larger, that's totally fine, but you need to account for the width of this head, the diameter. So instead of placing your nail directly into the holes, you need to offset by half of that distance, half of that diameter, so the radius. And therefore then when we go to bend our tracing thing around, it actually lines up with these points. The way we want to do this is we want to have this inside part going in the two nails at the end there, and then around this nail here at the top. Now you're going to want to give these a decent whack in there. We don't want them too far in that we can't get them out, but the springiness of the wood can bend a nail if it's not in there enough, especially these small ones. I have my 3 nails in. These 2 are offset by the radius up from these points, and this one is offset by the radius down from the point. Now we are just going to slide our piece between these 2, and you will see we have a really nice curve that we can now trace. And again, this is rough because we're going to do bandsaw and then sanding to firm it up, but we need some kind of way to guide us there. Now just make sure that as you're going around, this is held parallel. It helps to kind of just straighten it with your fingers as you go around. At this point now, you can pull this out, and you will see we have our curve nicely meeting up with all of our points. Our nail offset is going to be slightly different from the top, as we want the curve that we're going to trace to match up with the outside. On the bottom here, the middle nail was set downward by the radius of the nail head, and the outer two were set upward of the radius to the nail head. We're going to be flipping that for the above. So the two side ones will be above by the radius, and the middle one will be below by the radius to allow our tracing line to match with the top. All right, with your nails in, this is what it should look like. These two are slightly above the mark. This one's slightly below by the thickness of the radius of the head of the nail. And then we're just going to then do as so. So it will look like this. And then we will just trace out that shape the same way. And that will be your shape layout. Now you're going to need to copy this to your second piece in order to have them match for when we go to cut the grooves. For those of you in the circle plan, we are done there. And for those of you in the straight 2x6 plan, if you have a single piece of 2x6 with no knots in it, you're in luck. This is going to be super easy for you. The reason I suggest 2 is that plenty of them have knots in them. So if you have a piece with no knots, make sure you've ripped off the rounded edges, and this is going to be real easy because we're going to cut the slats straight across, and then you'll be able to just rip down the middle and they will exactly match each other. So if you can find a piece with no knot, great. If, however, you have a knot, have a second piece, and we'll still do this really easily so that you can have them match up nicely. Pick a side and just square that side off. That's going to be our reference side, and then we will do the other final length at the end, just in case we have any mismeasuring of the slots. Now to cut the slots, there are a couple ways to do this that's gonna make it a lot easier. If you have some setup blocks, that's really gonna help. However, we can also make our own setup blocks. Now what we're dealing with here are the spaces we want to cut out. I'm using 3/8 of an inch, and then having to deal with the kerf of the saw blade so that every time we move the piece over, we're factoring in that kerf so we're not cutting out more or less than we need. So if you have a setup block and you can match the kerf of your saw blade, perfect. If you do not have those, or if you want to make your own kind of story sticks for this, what you're going to need to do is get something that's 3/8 of an inch, cut a piece of wood like that, cut a piece of wood the same size as your saw kerf. And the reason you're doing these separately is so you can make sure each are correct. And then you're going to take the two of those, and what's easiest is to then put those together, stick them between your saw blade and the fence, and then rip a piece out that is 3/8 plus the kerf. And then you're going to do another one that is 3/8 minus the kerf. So you can cut out the longer one, or the thicker one, I should say, by placing the saw blade kerf piece in between the fence, and then you can remove that and subtract it for the next one. And I'll explain why this matters in a second. Just know that for setup blocks, if you have a thin kerf blade of any type from Freud, that's 3/32 exactly. Unfortunately, the Diablos do not match up perfectly with any of the standard setup blocks, and you're going to have to cut your own. Now, the easiest way to get this kerf is to just take a piece of wood, hold it up against your crosscut sled or your miter gauge, and just cut a single pass through it, then cut a strip out of thin wood to match and fit that snugly, and then you can use that as your kerf offset. I think that's the simplest way to make sure it's right. And by getting all of these right, it means we don't have to draw each one out and then try to align it. You can do it that way if you want, but you're gonna probably not get a nice clean fit every time. It's easier using setup blocks and spacers so we can just move the piece of wood over each time and we know that it's the same all the way through. So let's head over to our saw blade. You're gonna square up one end of all of your pieces, however many of these you're making, and then you're gonna label that as the reference side, whether you want to write that on there, put a mark, whatever, that's the reference side so we know directionally which one each of them is going to go. If you're using two separate pieces and your cuts aren't perfect, you're going to want them to be perfect opposite of each other so that when we go to slide the slats in, it doesn't pull it off one way or the other. Let's talk really quick about our choice in table saw blade here. Now I'm going to be using a flat top grind, meaning the slot will be nice and clean and flat on the bottom. I won't have to clean it up, or I won't have to worry about any kind of tiny little gaps. A normal kind of, let's say 40 tooth, I think all of the Diablos other than the combo blade are alternate tooth bevel, meaning you're going to be left with these little kind of peaks at the bottom that you'll either need to clean up with a chisel, or you can leave them and it just kind of leaves a little gap, but it is what it is. And then a combo blade will leave you with something similar, just less, because there is one flat tooth for every 4 of the alternating bevel teeth, and it cuts it off there instead of cutting it off there. So it's up to you. If you have a flat top grind or a combo, use that. If not, you're either going to need to chisel at the end or just leave it, and it is what it is. Let's very quickly walk through the point of the spacers and how they're used. Now, I call the kind of wood that we're leaving the space, because we're putting a space between the slats, and then where we're putting the slats is the groove. Now, the reason we have the spacers is to account for the kerf. Let's say we want to make the initial 3/8 of an inch cut, this guy right here. We would put our piece up against the table saw, and I will show you this at the table saw as well. And then we're going to add 3/8 of an inch plus the thickness of the kerf. And the reason we do that is that we want to be cutting right along this line here. If we do not take into account the kerf, we will end up cutting here. And conversely, when we want to get to the next one, we want 3/8 of an inch minus the kerf so that our cut ends up here and not here. If you do not correctly account for the kerf, you're not going to end up with 3/8 of an inch for either of them. It's going to be off by 1 kerf length every time. So it's very important to remember this and to use it for each cut. Now, another thing that I like to do is I like to just make each of these individual cuts first, and then I come back at the end and I remove the waste. I just think it's a little time consuming and unnecessary to remove the waste in each one as you're going through and cutting. It messes up with your spacing. Just go through, make all the initial cuts, and then we'll just come back at the end and take out the remaining waste in our grooves. Now, when we get to the table saw, the first thing we're going to do is decide how deep we want our grooves. If you want the kind of chunkier, thicker look, we'll go about 3/4 of an inch deep. If you want a more kind of sleek look, or if you're using 3/4 inch pine, maybe 5/16, 3/8 of an inch deep. This is kind of going to be up to you of how wide you want your slats to be in there. But just pick your depth, and we're going to keep that consistent throughout the entire cut. I'm going with 3/4 of an inch here for mine specifically. For those of you using 2 separate pieces, we've got our reference edge for both of those. Okay, that is going to face to the table saw blade. That's going to be our starting point. So it will look like this when we initially line it up. That way we will make the first 3/8 of an inch space in from the same edge on both of them. It's very important that you keep these aligned so that when you go to match them, it's like a book and it lines up across from one another. If you are just using one and you're going to split it later, if you don't have any knots in yours, you're just always keeping that same side towards the outside. The first thing we're going to do is we've got our reference edge, and we're going to place that up against the blade so that it's right up against there. We're then going to take a stop, whether that's on your miter gauge or something you clamp onto the crosscut sled, and you're going to pinch it in between there. Not so tight that it's pushing the blade, but so that there's no movement. It just sits right in there nicely. That gives us a 0 point to then go 3/8 of an inch over. Everything is referenced off of the outside reference edge. Here is the first important step. Now, because we are starting with a space, there will be spaces on each outside. We're going to take 3/8 of an inch, or if you're using 1/2 inch, plus the thickness of your kerf. For me, that's just nicely 3/32. If yours is not, you will have either gotten a setup block that matches, or you will have made your own. And what we're going to do is we're going to place that right between there. Now, you can either remove these and move the stop over now or do it afterwards. I like to do it now. Now, what that has done is it has accounted for the kerf and left us with exactly a 3/8 inch space on the outside here. Again, if you are using two separate pieces, your reference face needs to be facing the outside both times. Now that you've got both of those done, if you're doing two sides, you will now see why when it opens up, they will match perfectly. And this is how we keep this all in order in case you have just a slight variation. If you're off at all, it'll be off equally on both sides. Now for the next cut, where we are going to remove the groove, we are going to take our spacer that is 3/8 of an inch minus the curve. So for me, that works out to 9/32 because my blade is 3/32. You will have made this specific to your blade or found matching blocks. You will then just simply slip that in there. Again, keeping the same reference face outside, pinch that in there, move that over, and then now you are 3/8 of an inch over from this edge to the inside of the outer edge. We'll now cut that. Now that we've made that cut, we have removed exactly 3/8 of an inch in between. The next cut and so on becomes 3/8 of an inch plus your curve, 3/8 of an inch minus, plus, minus, plus, minus, all the way through, alternating each time. When you want a space, 3/8 of an inch plus. When you want a groove, 3/8 of an inch minus. You can replace 3/8 of an inch with whatever you want. It's just always plus, minus the curve of the blade. And this middle area is what I'm talking about coming back and removing later. There's no need to remove this now. We'll do it at the end once we've got all of these cut. At some point, you're probably asking yourself, well, this is getting a little sketchy if you're using a miter gauge to try to get to the end of this, right? Well, fortunately, we can just go the other way at the half. So let's say you've got to a point and the balance isn't perfect. Simply line up your last curve, and now we're gonna go the other way. So for me, I just cut a space, which means I'm now going to cut a groove, and then I would move it over. Then I would do a space, groove, and you just go all the way through to the other way. You don't have to try to hold this thing way over here at the very end. Just go the other way. The reason I like overcutting these is that we can go and then we come back and we just slice it off right at the very last one that we want. I've now got both of these ones done. I've still got some more to do. If you make a mistake at some point and you say are doing numerous of these and forget to cut one before you move it over, and then you come back and you cut it and you've now ended up with one weird kind of space, what I suggest doing is once you notice that, ideally, immediately stop and do a space after your miscut, and then continue on as normal from there. Now what I'm going to do, I've got a curve, and curve here. I've got 4 little problem spots. I could either remove this whole section and make it one thick, beefy one. Not going to do that. I'm going to remove this tiny little middle spot from my miscut, and I'm going to put a curve thickness piece of wood here, a slightly double curve plus a little there, and then another curve thickness piece. Congratulations, you just made a feature. And how you want to handle that is up to you, but just be careful if you're batching out a bunch of these to put them all in order, because you can obviously see I messed this one up. This is a great time if you have different colored pieces of wood or access to any of them to put something contrasting in this kind of mess up feature so that it looks intentional. If you, however, did this correctly, now we're going to go back and end this one as well and just remove all the space in between to only leave your 3/8 inch gaps. At that point, you can go ahead and just rip this in half and you will have your 2 ends, and we will go ahead from there, trim this, and then make the slats. Now that we've got this done, congratulations, the hardest part is over if you're doing the more simple version, and the second hardest part is over if you're doing the curve. Now, if you're doing the curve, these are to a set width based on what we've already drawn out. So you're all done there in terms of the rip. If you're doing it out of a single piece or even out of 2, because these are going to be straight, you can decide the width at this point, whether you want to have it chunky, kind of like these, or whether you want it narrower. Go ahead and decide that and rip it. And then after that's ripped, we're going to then just trim all of these so that our final overhang here, and this is why we leave it long, is 3/8 of an inch and it matches the other one. Sometimes if you get these off a little bit, if you would cut this exactly to 9 3/8, this one would be a little thinner than the other one. It's much easier aesthetically to come back and reference where this cut is and then go 3/8 from there. All right, now we are done with these. These are at the final length and width dimensions if you're doing the simpler one. The first thing we want to do is decide on a key aesthetic choice. Do you want the slats to sit flush or do you want them a little proud? If you sit them a little proud, it's just a different aesthetic choice. That's up to you. I'm going to sit mine a little proud. I just kind of like the look. I saw the photo online and I thought it looked pretty cool. So I'm going to sit a little proud, probably a 1/4 inch or so. That may not be a little to some of you, but decide now either flush or proud. And that's going to then determine after we rip our strips out whether you need to cut them to width or whether they're good as is. If you have a planer, you can just get them to the final thickness ahead of time. Now, the big tip here is that plan to not be perfect. And what we're going to do is assume that some of these aren't perfectly identical. We're going to assume that at least one of them is a little smaller than the other one. So when we go to cut our strips, we're going to cut a hair, maybe 2 hairs over 3/8 of an inch. Why? Because we want to also be able to sand off any blade marks, kind of round over the top. We want to make them nice and smooth so that no matter where someone may grab it, it's got a good feel to it. So we do not want these to be a perfect fit off the table saw unless you believe you can nail it or you don't want to clean off blade marks if you get any. If you're like me, you want to have the ability to remove some material. You can't add it back on. So just cut a test piece or test pieces as needed to get it so that when you go to press it in, you just can't quite get it in there, but it feels like you're real close. Like if you were to just take a mallet and smack it, it would go in there, but you would struggle a bit to press it in there. That means we're at the right amount so that we can just remove the blade marks, sand it out, make it feel good, and then it will slip in really nice and tight. I just wanted to give you an idea of the tightness I'm talking about. Now, we do not want to have to be malleting these in there because these will break if it's too tight. So I've got this one to where I like it. And I could, if I really wanted to, jam that thing in there, but it's too tight to really make it comfortable. And that's gonna give me just enough to sand off. I got a couple little blade marks on here, not too much, but I'm gonna be able to sand this and then we'll have glue in there and it will slide in nice and tight and we won't have to pound it down, which could break some of these off if you've used a wood that's softer than not. For those using construction lumber, and it may happen to the others as well, be prepared for some of these strips to come out bowed, curved. Construction lumber often isn't dried perfectly, and when you start trying to rip it into small strips, thin strips, some of those kind of end up just kind of going all over the place. So cut some extra, or be prepared, I should say, to cut some extra and have a few of them that are not going to be usable at all. Now, if you want, you could cut these to final length ahead of time. I'm planning on doing 15 inches in length. Based on what I saw, that fits a nice one of those glass, like lasagna style dishes. Now, before you cut your slats out, you also have an aesthetic choice to make here. Most wood that you're gonna get at the lumberyard comes flats on, especially 2x4s. They're flats on, meaning the grain kind of runs like this. I, for this project, really like the tighter grain look. So instead of ripping out 3/8 of an inch down this way, I took an inch out, which is gonna be roughly the height I want. I want them to sit a little proud. And I cut 1-inch strips out like so, and then I'm going to turn them over and rip my slightly over 3/8 of an inch strip out from that, leaving me with this kind of tighter grain look. I had a nice surprise when I ripped into the sassafras. There were some wormholes in certain areas, so I got lucky that I had enough to be able to do that while taking out some of the wormhole ones. But this is an aesthetic choice. If you want this kind of flat sawn grain, go ahead and just rip it out this way. But I just think this tighter grain is a better look for kind of a traditional kitchen setting. The way I'm going to cut these out that I think will be most efficient and accurate is to set slightly over 3/8 of an inch. And then one at a time, I'm going to use the featherboard. So I'll cut one from all of them and then come back, move the featherboard in, cut one. That way I can keep the featherboard pressure and I don't have to adjust it going through each of these. I only have to adjust it after going through all of the strips one time. And if you do not like the idea of putting your fence within this kind of distance from the table saw, this would be a good time to consider an auxiliary fence. Now, they sell these clamps for like $15 on Amazon. I just happen to have this from a past project. I usually don't bring this out until I'm getting down to around like 1/8 of an inch. But if I were to ever damage this, I would also be very upset at myself. So if you are a little unsure about getting 3/8 of an inch from your blade from the fence, go ahead and use a sacrificial fence. This doesn't have to be these. You can use any kind of clamp to hold it on. You just need to be able to make sure you can get all the way through the blade without running into these. Now that you've got your slats out, and you should have a few extra, I want to say that if you are planning to cut any shape in this, whether you're doing the curved one or maybe you want to put a bevel on the back, take one of your extras, or even before you totally move the table saw, just tap it in a little bit and get one that fits. Because if you're planning to cut a shape in this at all, we're going to need to fill these, not with something we can't get out. We want it to be able to get out, but fill these with pieces of wood so that when it goes through the saw, there's a backer on every single one for the cut so we don't get tear out. And also, if you're using a kind of a dull-ish blade in that first entry cut, it could just totally break one of these off or cause really bad chipping. So take one of your extras, and if you're planning to do any shapes, we're going to want to fill these temporarily. If you are not planning to do any kind of shape, now is the time when we can move on to sanding. You can also, if you're doing the shape, go ahead and sand now. There's two options. One, each of these by hand one at a time. That's what I'm going to do. I like to control a little more. Or two, spread them all out and either on some kind of non-slip surface, or spread them all out and just put a piece of duct tape over it, flip it over, and then sand it with your random orbit sander as if it's one solid flat piece of wood. I would, however, warn you, it's very easy with a random orbit sander to go too far. Ideally, if your saw blade and your table saw were set up roughly well, you do not have many saw marks on here, which is why I think hand sanding is the ideal here. We're really close to fit anyways. We just want to remove those and we just want to get it softened. So be very careful if you're planning to do the spread them out in random orbit sander. It's really easy to go overboard and it's a loose fit. Now for me, I'm going to do probably a mineral oil finish on this if I have any, or a boiled linseed oil or something like that. Nothing with a film finish because I don't want anything that'll be able to get kind of burned or melted or whatever from sitting a hot pan or a hot baking dish on there. So I need these to be smooth when I put the oil on because that's how they're going to feel when they're touching. I'm going to go up to 400. And I'm also going to round over, or just chamfer, soften, let's call it, soften all of the edges, because wherever somebody grabs this, we want that to be a soft, nice, gentle spot. I thought about putting little kind of handholds into it, but as someone who's been in a kitchen before, I know that after the first few weeks, people just pick stuff up however they want. They don't always go, oh, these nice little handholds. No, they just grab it, they set it down somewhere. It's not going to get used all the time. This is what it should look like before we go to the bandsaw, or any shape, whether you're cutting a bevel, anything like that. We want these gaps filled so we don't get tear out or any broken pieces. I should have mentioned earlier, if you're a hand plane person, this is going to be smoother for you. I'm more of a sanding person, so I default to sanding, but when it's rough stuff, I'll grab the hand plane. Anyways, for most of you, this is just going to be straightforward. Just go ahead and cut this out, do both of them. I'm not going to show a bunch of me doing that, and then we'll come back. Now, obviously, do not cut to the line. It's almost certainly you're not going to get it perfect from the bandsaw, so we're going to have to sand from there. Just do your best. I like to call this kind of moment in a project Operation Don't F It Up. We've done a lot of work, so we're going to try not to F it up. If you have two pieces that look like this, congratulations, you completed Operation Don't F It Up. All you got to do now is sand this to the line, just kind of make sure, visually it looks correct, and both of them do. And then you will have finished the hardest part of all of this, in my opinion, getting this looking nice, even, and not breaking. Now, there's a couple different ways you can sand this. You can either do it by hand, if you have a disc sander or one of those rigid, I guess I'll call it a belt sander, spindle sander. That's going to work well. I'm going to take it to my drill press where I have a little spindle sander thing. You could also, if you want, set it up like this and go back and forth. Just make sure to check it quite frequently. And, oh, Jesus Christ. And I like to prevent any further harm happening. One thing I wanted to mention on the sanding as well is that because these may not all be perfect unless you are perfect, I like to number or letter each of them and then make sure the one that's sanded and fits perfectly there corresponds to that. So when I'm going to assemble later, I don't run into a situation where I've got glue in a space, I'm going to put it in there, and oh crap, it's one that's for a slot that's slightly too big or too small, and it doesn't fit right. It's either too loose or too tight. I finished the sanding on this. This isn't really a step. I just wanted to say it's all done. At least the initial. Now, I want to point something out because I made a mistake here. I rounded over the very ends of a couple of these slats. So if I were to glue it at exactly 15 inches from the back side, there'd look to be a little gap. So the ones that are going to be setting your determination and your distance, if you follow my dimensions, are these two in the middle here. So you can use those two to play with where you want it. I just need to move mine in about 1/8 of an inch on either side, and those disappear. And then because they're all 15 inches, these can just be kind of slotted in at whatever distance. We'll trim it off later. So it's late, and I finished the sanding, so very happy. All right, I've got the sanding done. I think this guy's gonna look great, but I'm not thrilled with how plain this looks. And if you wanna leave it here, that's fine. You wanna keep this look. I already decided to shave off maybe 1/2 inch from either end. I thought it just looked a little chunky, and I'm still not thrilled with this. So I'm gonna add a slight kind of, I'm not going to call it a chamfer, but an angle back here on the table saw by just running, obviously not all together, but each one through as if I was cutting a long bevel. To do this, I am going to cut out little pieces to stick in each of these so that I don't get any tear out, so that none of the little spaces get just ripped right off. So it's a little extra work, but not a ton. And I think it's going to look really cool. I'm not going to remove a ton of width here. I'm not taking this chamfer all the way to the bottom. I'm only going to take off some of the side here. You'll see that when I'm done. And the final width of this is going to end up being about 1 3/4. It looks a little better that way in my opinion. I'm just eyeballing this. I've got it at about 64-ish degrees. And then I'm ending up with 1 1/4 on the inside of the blade, meaning I will be left with 1 1/4 of flat space up top here. And I've got it set that way too, so that at this height, I will also have a flat spot on the bottom. It would just sort of be an angle taken out. So we'll see how that looks. I'm gonna start there. I can always take off more. I can't take off less. I think that looks much better. Just much more detail going on, and yet it's a simple single bevel rip cut. And you can see because I filled those gaps in, nothing tore out, nothing broke. You don't have to do that, but I'd highly suggest it. So I'm going to go and do the other side. So after looking at that, I'm much happier with that. Just know that if you make any alteration to this, and obviously to the circular one, you have to have a way to trim that off. In this case, some kind of flush trim is going to be ideal. Flush trim handsaw, that's going to be the easiest. So if you don't have a way to cut these flush, don't do this because they're going to be sticking awkwardly proud. Now, I want to say here, there's going to be some temptation for some people to stain this because it's a little plain Jane. And that's okay, but I would suggest if you are going to stain, having these be slightly proud, which I have both of mine slightly proud, and only staining these two bases here. So maybe you stain these two pieces dark and it kind of looks like a walnut maple style figure there. I'm a little nervous about the idea of staining the top here when hot pots, pans, whatever go on top of it. And while I'm not saying this is an absolute no-no to stain all of this, just be aware that it's possible there could be some marks left over if something hot kind of alters any of the coloration in the stain afterwards, because we're not putting a film finish on here, due also to the fact that we don't want hot things messing up the finish on that. So at most, personally, I would only stain these two end pieces, and I certainly think that could add a lot of character to it as well. My only tips for gluing up here are that each of these has a middle point that is two strips matching. And when I go to glue, I'm going to glue those first. And I'm not going to wait like 24 hours for those to dry, but I'm going to place glue in those two first in the middle, let that tack and set up for maybe 10-15 minutes, and that will establish my distance so that I know everything else is going to match up distance-wise and I don't have to worry there. I'm also going to do them one at a time. If I put glue in everything first, it's quite possible if it takes me a bit that by the time I get all the way down to here, these are going to be tacky and I'm going to have to be just whacking on it with a mallet, and I prefer not to do that. When you go to glue up either this one or if you just left it flat, like I said earlier, if you want, even though these are 15 inches, you can just kind of knock it in maybe 1/8 of an inch so that if you are not perfect on all of these when you put them across, you're not going to have any little gaps, and then you can just flush trim. Or if you don't put them more than, a 32nd or a 16th, you can just kind of flush sand. After the glue up, these came out very well. I'm currently in the process of trimming everything down, and this one's looking great, but I screwed up. I didn't change the blade on my bandsaw to something a little fresher with a higher tooth count. I just had the one on there that I used to resaw and really rough rip. It's like a 3 tooth per inch. And I got some pretty gnarly tear out. So you can probably see right up here, not good, not great. So I done goofed, and I think I'm gonna round all of this over to try to hide some of that and maybe a little bit of sanding, but there's not a whole lot I can do. There's just flat out material missing. So I did not fully complete Operation Don't F It Up, but I'm still very happy with that one. Just be careful when you're trimming that. If you're on the bandsaw, higher tooth blade. I'm just flush trimming these and then a little chisel work, and then I'm going to end up just sanding. One thing I highly suggest is that if you are chiseling or flush trimming or anything, you end up finishing all of your cuts going down because this bottom area is supported by other wood fibers. If you chisel up like that, I guarantee you are going to tear something out. Just be very delicate. We are so close to the end here. Now, I am not putting handles in this, but I'm going to tell you the 2 ways that I would do this if you wanted some kind of like grip here. I just don't think there's enough room on this size one to do it. I think it would look a little goofy. I like the look. So I'm not going to do that, but I came up with 2 methods of how I would. All right, method 1, just picture this being the back of the cooling tray. I just took a marking knife, marking gauge, marked out a place, used the Forstner bit to remove waste, and then I would just go through and chisel it. Ideally, if you can get right into the corner there, you can actually leave that rounded off, just a nice little touch. Very basic. You are going to be left with the kind of brad point holes though. So you're gonna have to decide whether that one's right for you, but that's option 1. And I think the most basic. You can see why on the height, I don't love that. I'd have to go quite a ways up on the other ones height-wise, and I think it'll just look goofy. So I'm not doing it for that purpose, but that's option 1. Option number 2 leaves you with something looking more like this, a little more rounded, perhaps a little cleaner, though this test piece got some tear out. I am using a cove bit with a bearing, though I think ideally if you have a bullnose bit, which is essentially kind of like a cove but without a bearing, and then I just set up 2 stops, and I just plunge in, over, plunge out, and that leaves a pretty consistent, nice kind of rounded field there. Again, you'd have to go up so high here to make it really work if you have larger fingers. I just don't like that, but that's up to you. If you have a bullnose bit, this is going to be easier because you'll be able to go even deeper into here. With the cove bit, you're limited by the bearing. But if you only have a cove bit, you can at least get some level of handle in there, and it kind of, has a bit of a nicer rounded edge look. So it's up to you. Those are the 2 ways which I would do a handle based on what I own. Done all my final checks and my final sanding, and I'm 99% sure that it's done. I've softened all the edges, all of that. Now, I'm going to end up using boiled linseed oil for the finish purely because like 5 years ago, I bought a bottle of mineral oil and it sat on a shelf for 5 years, and I can't find it now. I love my brother, but I'm not buying a bottle of mineral oil for a single project. So he's getting boiled linseed oil. I'm going to live with that. I think mineral oil is probably the ideal finish for this, as it's the kind of go-to food safe kitchen project finish, but it is what it is. I don't expect food to be eaten off of here. It's for cooling things down. I would not use some kind of film finish. I don't think that's a good idea when you're going to have things that are hot on there. Just make sure that you've checked that the top's fairly flat before you apply finish and any little sanding you need to do. Other than that, though, these should be done. Obviously, make sure you sign your piece if it's going to be a gift. And I know some people with cutting boards and large things, they just fill up a tub of mineral oil or whatever and dunk it in there, but I'm cheap, so I'm painting it on because I don't want to waste any. I did find one funny thing. After I trimmed off the edges, I found that this guy, just a nice little like piece of knot shining through, just totally destroys the clean overall look, but that's what you get from a 2x4 and not paying attention earlier. Well, it's been about 24, 30 some hours, and these are both dry and done. I'm going to eventually add a second coat of boiled linseed oil. You can do one, you can do two. The closer you're doing these to Christmas, you might not want to put a second one on. It may not fully dry in time. So perhaps try to build these a little early before you have to give the gift. But overall, I am thrilled with how these turned out. I think this one looks great. And I think this one's a really cool look as well. And I'm going to gift this to somebody too. And for only needing a table saw, a flush trim saw, and some sandpaper, I think this is a great project right here. It's very cheap if you're going to go with the 2x6 route. So hopefully that's walked you through everything you need to know to make these. Thank you very much for joining me today. Have a good one.